Well, hello there, and welcome back to our series of videos on the topic of inheritance. Now, in this video, we'll be talking about natural selection. Some of you might think of evolution, might think of apes becoming men, but what exactly is natural selection? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. Now, any lesson on natural selection would not be complete without the case study of the peppered moths. So these peppered moths, a very famous story of them, they come in two varieties, right? There's the dark variety over here, and there's the light variety over here. And the history goes that originally, in 1848, about 5% of all peppered moths were dark, while the other 95% were light. However, just 7 years later, I believe this is an error, just 7 years later, the fortunes of the moths switched, and of all the moths, 98% were dark and 2% were light. Now, what exactly led to this drastic change in the frequency of dark and light moths? That was a question that a lot of scientists were asking. And it turns out that it had a lot to do with what happened in the 19th century, which was the Industrial Revolution. You see, it turned out that because of the Industrial Revolution, many of the trees from a light colored bark became dark colored bark, and that favored the survival of the dark moths. So the dark moths increased in frequency while the light moths decreased in frequency over time. So the pollution in the Industrial Revolution killed off the lichen on the trees, and that caused the bark to become darker. So the dark moths were better able to camouflage, more survived, more reproduced compared to the light moths, and over time the number of dark moths increased. Indeed, the predators of the moths were more able to identify and to eat up the white moths than the dark moths. So what we've just seen is an example of natural selection. Nature selects those varieties which are more better adapted to the environment. And in this case, the dark moths were better adapted to camouflage with the dark bark. Now, the theory of natural selection started with this man called Charles Darwin, who went on a voyage on a boat called the Beagle. And on all his voyages, he saw many different animals, many different plants, and he came up with this theory of natural selection to try to explain how these many species came about. He lived in this period of time, which you can see actually overlaps very much with the case of the peppered moths. So what exactly is the theory of natural selection? Well, it comes in sort of four parts or four statements. And first, for natural selection to happen, you need to have variation. So for example, in the moths, we had dark moths and we had light moths. So first, you need to have variation. So there is variation in the population, and variation arises due to two things, sexual reproduction as well as mutation. We saw how mutation produces new alleles in the last video. So new alleles means variation. Now, besides variation, natural selection also occurs only when there is competition. Only when there is limited resources and where there are more individuals produced each generation than can survive. So if all the individuals could survive, if there was enough resources to keep everyone alive, then nature wouldn't have to select some to survive better than others, if there's enough resources. But more often than not, there's limited food, there's limited space, there are predators trying to hunt you, and so there's a sort of selection which nature will do and will select those individuals which are better able to survive while others will die out. So we have variation and we have competition. And then next we have the idea of differential survival and reproduction, which means basically that different individuals, different varieties, will have different rates of survival and reproduction. Those which are better adapted will have a higher rate of survival and a higher rate of reproduction. And it is nature that selects those which are better adapted. And that's why this process is called natural selection. So those which are better adapted, the better adapted varieties, will survive longer. For example, the dark moths were able to survive longer, they were able to reproduce more, and they were able to pass on more of their genes to the next generation. So as a result, in the next generation, you will see an increase in the frequency of favorable traits. So for example, in the moth, right, in the next generation, you would see an increase in the frequency of dark moths and also an increase in the frequency of the allele for dark color. Okay, so just to summarize, right, when there is variation and when there is competition, then natural selection will happen. And natural selection is a process where nature will select those varieties, right, of an organism which are better adapted to their environment. Or we say that they have a selective advantage. They have a certain advantage over the other varieties. For instance, they could be better camouflaged like the moths, or they could be more resistant to diseases, or they could just have a greater ability to get the food and hence to survive and to reproduce. Now often in natural selection, you also hear the phrase survival of the fittest. So what exactly does fitness mean in biology? Over here you see two men, and the question is, which man is fitter? Well, the answer is actually this man here. Even though he has less muscles, even though he has less, in that sense, physical fitness and strength, this man here has actually managed to produce offspring. He's managed to pass on his genes to the next generation. And so in a sense, he is fitter. So in biology, fitness is not about physical strength. It's not about even, how much food you can find. Fitness is purely the ability to produce offspring and to pass on genes to the next generation. Right? So the key point here is that you need to have offspring and you need to pass on your genes to the next generation in order to be fit. Okay, so let's apply our theory of natural selection to what we've seen with the peppered moths. Again, the key points are there is variation, and then there is competition, and when there is variation and competition, there will be natural selection. So nature will select those varieties which are better adapted to the environment. And as a result, the frequency of favorable varieties or traits will increase in the population. Right? So there'll be more of those alleles which give those advantageous traits. So in the case of the moths, we had variation, black and white moths. And then there was a competition to survive, right? The birds eating them. And then next, natural selection takes place. The black varieties, the black moths are able to survive better on the dark colored bark because they can camouflage better. And as a result, the frequency of black moths and the alleles that give rise to black color would increase in the population. Now, another application of natural selection which we have seen in the real world, which scientists have observed, is this idea of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Antibiotics are medicines which are artificially made to kill bacteria. And you might be asked by the doctor to eat antibiotics and stuff. But actually, eating antibiotics might actually encourage bacteria to over time evolve and become antibiotic resistant. And that's a result of natural selection. So what happens in this case is that, in your body, right, there might be, there is variation. So there might be bacteria which are antibiotic resistant. So some bacteria might just mutate, right? So they might acquire a gene, they mutate and they gain a beneficial gene, right, of antibiotic resistance. While other bacteria do not mutate, so they remain non-resistant. And then there's competition to survive, right? The bacteria are all in your body, and when you eat the antibiotics, right, the antibiotics kill off all the non-resistant bacteria, but the antibiotic-resistant ones can survive and reproduce more. So nature selects, right, those bacteria which are antibiotic-resistant, and as a result, in the next generation, you will see a greater frequency of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and you also see an increase in the frequency of the allele that gives antibiotic resistance. Now, what are the sort of environmental factors that can result in natural selection? What environmental factors can produce competition and result in natural selection? The first one, over here, this picture here, would be your climate, your temperature. So imagine if there are long-furred and short-furred animals. If there's a very cold environment, right, so imagine this is a long fur version of the cow, and then there's a short fur version of the cow. If the temperature rises very high, then it would favor the short hair cow, right? The short hair cows would be better adapted, and so their frequency would increase, while the long hair cows might die. But if the temperatures became very cold, then you get the reverse. Now, another environmental factor that leads to natural selection is predators. So predators actually result in competition, right? Because the animals, the prey, will try to compete to see who can survive the predators. Next, we also have the type of food available. So there's usually limited amounts of food, or maybe the food will be in certain places on a very high up tree, right? The food is all here. And then it's favorable for animals to have long necks to get the food, right? And then the short-necked varieties will die out in comparison. And finally, another force that can act as a force of natural selection would be diseases. So when diseases sweep through an area, right, those individuals who are resistant, who have alleles that give them resistance, they will survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes, while those who have no resistance would die out. So at this point, it will be very helpful for you to try out this checkpoint question in your worksheet. And once you have tried it out, you can continue this video and look at the answers. Okay, so here's the answer. Alright, so what's the factor that results in natural selection? In this case, it will be your predation, your birds which eat the mice, and also the color of the soil, because that gives an advantage to some mice over the other. Right, how do you explain what happens? You need to talk about your main 4 points. So there's variation. There are black and white fur mice. Then there's competition between the black and white fur mice due to limited resources, due to the presence of predators. And then there's natural selection. So individuals with white fur are better adapted because they can camouflage better. So nature selects them due to natural selection. You must always mention natural selection in your answer. So due to natural selection, individuals with white fur will survive better, reproduce better, and pass on more of their genes. And therefore, over time, the frequency of individuals with white fur will increase. So what's the genetic change that takes place? When we talk about genetic change, we talk about alleles. So over time, there will be an increase in the frequency of the allele which produces white fur, while there is also a decrease in the frequency of the allele that produces black fur. Alright, I'll pause at this point, and in the next video, we'll look at evolution by natural selection.